Shabbat Night Live. It's because of you we get to share really neat things about this scroll. This scroll in particular, we were talking about Leviticus, and there's more to tell about this scroll and Leviticus.
So the morning after Nehemiah comes to my house, he shares about this hole. And when I saw the hole, it stopped for me. Everyone else is wanting to look more and more and more, and I wanted to do my dance. It was as if I was back in Israel. If you didn't see last week's Shabbat Night Live, it's where Nehemiah and I and Michael first unrolled the scroll. I said to Nehemiah, we got to call this unrolling the scroll again. Because when he unrolls it this time, I don't know that that's there. I've never seen it. I wouldn't know what it was.
Right.
I didn't know about this whole issue of Leviticus 24. So think of this, Scott. The first time Nehemiah and I opened the scroll, it's Leviticus 23. God's time. The second time we open the scroll, it's Leviticus 24, God's name. And this is something that we have been dealing with for now it's well over a decade. It's been since 2002. He was the first person that when I sat down with him, I asked him a question. I'm with Michael at his house. We're sitting at the next day. It's the day after he's seen the scroll, and he's a little wondering, like, who is this guy, right? So now we're sitting across from the place where God placed his name forever, the Temple Mount. I asked Nehemiah a question. I said, can you tell me anything about the name of God? He said, do you have a piece of paper and pencil? I said, yes, piece of paper. He writes, Yud, Hey, Vav, Hey. And he goes on and he talks and he says, according to the oldest, most complete Hebrew manuscripts in the world, which, by the way, I brought to that television station, which are the basis for their Bibles, and they said, we can't have those manuscripts there. It would be pronounced Yehováh. Now, because I have a witness here, here's what happened. As soon as Nehemiah says Yehováh, there's a man standing in front of us. With a huge shofar. Was it not huge? And the guy, Nehemiah says the name, and the guy blows the shofar twice. I happen to have it recorded. Ask me where the tape is. I have no idea. But it happened, did it not? And that started a process, Scott, of just being what I call, Jeremiah says, it was like fire caught up. If I do not speak in your name, it's like it's burning in my soul. So we wrote a book together, A Prayer to Our Father, Hebrew Origins of the Lord's Prayer. Great book, went around the world talking about it, came here, talked about it, but there's a phrase where Yeshua says, Yit Kadesh Shimcha, your name be sanctified. So I go to Nehemiah, I said, okay, Nehemiah, second book's gonna be on this phrase. And this is one of our big arguments. I said, Nehemiah, we gotta write about this. And he says, Keith, if we write about that specifically, we're not invited anywhere. It was a huge, we went back and forth. And I said, Nehemiah, I just feel strongly we got to do this. Here's what the hidden secret is I can tell on Shabbat Night Live. My ultimate goal for writing this book was to make him jealous. Why? I wanted Nehemiah to write about the name of God, and he wouldn't write it with me. So I said, if I write it, eventually he'll come up with another book. Guess what, Scott? It happened just the way I planned.
I had to write my book when I was ready to write my book.
He had to write his book. Hold on before.
Yeah.
Let me just say this. So Leviticus 24, one of the things that I do in this book is it's not so much about pronunciation. It's giving people the background. So I'm praying the other day. He tells me about this word. I look in my book, and sure enough, there's a whole thing about blaspheming the name. A really important issue that's been mistranslated historically.
Oh, it's a complete mistranslation.
Mistranslated completely.
It's not blaspheming at all. It's nothing to do with it.
Yeah. So my point is, when this scroll opens up, Scott, and I see this, I don't know. I didn't connect the two. It takes me a little while. Getting older, I lost my glasses, etc. I go to this page. Let me just read one little small thing, and then I'm going to turn it over because we're going to ask a question. The age of this scroll and where it came from.
Okay.
I call this the second fire-fueling passage may not be as well known as the third commandment, but the interpretation and application have reached beyond the walls of synagogues and churches. This passage must be examined according to what I consider the most underused concept in the study of Scripture, context. It was this word where I had to also call Nehemiah, because the JPS does something really interesting, the Jewish Publication Society. They translate the verse, and there's one little word, I think it's the word also, that the JPS puts in there. So I'm not going to go into that right now, because what I really want to get to is this. I really feel like this is the second act on this scroll. The first act, me, Michael, and Nehemiah. The second act, we're back to it again. And I will tell you, I've sent a message to Michael. I sent him a message.
Okay.
A couple weeks ago. I said, Michael, when you get back, it's time for us to do a conference again on the name of God. And he said, if Yah's willing. And I believe, Nehemiah, in terms of the information that's come since this happened, it's taken things to a completely different level. The amount of places where it's been found, the work that Nehemiah and his group has done, it literally has changed everything. So what I stepped out in by faith has now been confirmed in a really, really powerful way. After this was done, I asked Nehemiah, well, what do you think on the age? And this changes the game again.
Now, before you get to the age, I don't want to leave Leviticus 24:16.
Okay, excellent, excellent.
So Leviticus 24:16 in let's say the NRSV, for example, has one who blasphemes the name of the Lord shall be put to death. It doesn't say blasphemes at all. What it says is one who explicitly utters the name of Yehováh, and the context there is a curse. Now, I've had people say to me, well, Nehemiah, of course you speak the name because you're not a rabbinical Jew, you're a Karaite, and the Karaites think it's Yehováh. Actually, no, they don't. The position of, I mentioned this in my book, Shattering Conspiracy of Silence. That's my book on that I've written about the name and other things.
Amen.
And I explain there that the position of many Karaites is, well, we just don't have a tradition to speak the name, so we don't do it. And the position of other Karaites is, well, it's not a matter of we don't have a tradition, it's actually forbidden. And there was a 9th century Karaite named Daniel al-Kumasi, and he argued that it was based on this verse, Leviticus 24:16. He said, if you speak God's name, you're to be put to death, so it's forbidden to speak it. But then he says something profound. He says, don't rely on what I say. Go study the scriptures for yourself and decide based on your own discernment rather than blindly following what I say. And I did what he suggested, and I did not accept that conclusion that he had. I said in the context, clearly, it means to speak God's name when you're cursing, and that's what the JPS does. Translates, if he also pronounces the name, also there is while you're cursing God's name. And where do they get the word also? They didn't just make it up. They take that from the Vav.
Amen.
You have the letter Vav in Hebrew has so many different meanings. It literally means also, but it also can mean also. The Vav can also mean also. It can mean but. It can mean or. It can mean all kinds of other things. And in the context, they say this has to be referring to, in the context of a curse, therefore it has a sense of something like also. Also, meaning in addition to cursing God, you then speak the name, then you're to be put to death. That is the meaning in its context of Leviticus 24:16. Now, Keith asked me the question, where is this Torah scroll from? And I've been traveling around the world studying Torah scrolls, and I've learned a whole lot about Torah scrolls, but dating a Torah scroll and identifying where it came from can be very, very challenging. And especially if it's a relatively late Torah scroll. And what do I mean by relatively late? Although even early ones. There's this project that was established in Israel decades ago called the Hebrew Paleography Project. And they traveled around the world and they studied Bible, or not just Bible, they studied Hebrew manuscripts of all kinds, not just Bible manuscripts. And they looked for manuscripts where the date was included in the manuscript. And what do I mean by that? The scribe would finish writing, and he would say, this was completed on the 5th day of Tevet, the year 5200, right? Which is 5200 according to the rabbinical calendar. Right now, we're in the year 5781 in the rabbinical calendar. They say that's Anno Mundi from creation. Michael has a different reckoning. Myself, I don't know exactly. I say give or take 250 years, right? It's approximately right. So they traveled around, they documented all the manuscripts in the world, Bible and non-Bible, to see what the date was and what the script looked like. And that's the science of paleography. It's not an exact science, though. And then to make matters worse, they said, well, we can't look at all the manuscripts in the world. They're still making Torah scrolls. We'll never be done. And they said, we're going to look only up until the year 1540. Why 1540? Because that was the Hebrew year 5300. So it was the beginning of a new Hebrew century. And it was also about 100 years after the printing press was introduced into Europe and became widespread. After the Gutenberg Bible was roughly 1450. This is 100 years later. It's a new Hebrew century. Anything after 1540, we just don't have time to do it. Right? There's too many. In our lifetime, we can't finish what we're doing if we don't put a deadline, like an end date. So, how do you date scrolls after 1540? Good luck with that. It's not easy. So I sent photos of this scroll to one of the top experts in the world. And he said that, again, he told me what I know, that it's very difficult to date scrolls. Scrolls in general have another problem. And the problem they have is that by its nature, a scroll is archaic, right? I mean, it's a handwritten scroll in the 21st century, right? And they're still making them today, right? So you're using a technology that ceased really with the printing press, more or less ceased. And that's books at all handwritten. Scrolls ceased really in like the 8th century. Outside the Jewish world, scrolls, other than the British Parliament, which actually produces scrolls are extremely rare in the world today, and have been for the last 1,000 years. So, right there, I mean, here's a special case of having a scroll, which is a Torah scroll. So he said, with all that said, this appears to me to be a scroll from Yemen, and it's a scroll from either the end of the 19th or the beginning of the 20th century. And of course, we were hoping he would say, it's a 1,000-year-old scroll written in the land of Israel by Aaron Ben Asher himself. Okay, it's a late 19th, early 20th century scroll written in Yemen. Now, that makes it a very special scroll in and of itself.
Oh.
Because the Jews of Yemen you had Jews all over the world. They were scattered in the diaspora. And the Jews of Yemen have an incredible story. And this scroll has an incredible story of how it got to Israel, where Keith purchased it, where he got a hold of it. Now, I don't know this specific one because I didn't have a GPS tracker on it. But scrolls of this sort, this is how they got to Israel. So you had Jews in Yemen, and Yemen is part of the Arabian Peninsula, and the people who ruled there for last 1,400 years were Muslims. And we have this narrative we've been told that Jews suffered horribly in Christian countries, but in Muslim countries, they had it pretty good. That's the myth that we've been told. And there is some truth to that. But if we're really honest, Jews living in Christian countries were, think about African Americans living in the South before the Civil War. Were things good? No. Compare that to African Americans living in the South after the Civil War, before the Civil Rights Movement, right? Things were better, but they weren't good. And that's what it was like for Jews living in Muslim countries. It was like African Americans or black folks in the South after the Civil War, before the Civil Rights Movement. And Yemen was an exception. The Jews in Yemen had it worse than any other Jews, maybe even than most Jews in Christian countries. Yemen, they were fanatical Muslims. And for example, in the 17th century, they banished all the Yemenite Jews to this one area for a period of a year. And somewhere between 2/3 and 3/4 of the Yemenite Jews died in a period of a year. That was the Yemenite Holocaust. That's what it was like for Jews in Yemen. There was a period where they were forcibly being converted to Islam. And they held tightly onto their faith, and many of them were martyred. Many of them died. Maimonides writes about this in the 12th century. And in Yemen, they never had a printing press. The Jews didn't have a printing press. And they were living in the Middle Ages. And I mean, up until 1950, they were living in the Middle Ages, which is, like, what do you mean? The Middle Ages ended with the Renaissance, or maybe you could say ended, with the emancipation of the Jews in Europe in the 1780s, 1800, right? Depending how you date the in different areas of Europe and different areas of the world, the Middle Ages. But the Jews in Yemen, their Middle Ages ended in 1950. And what happened in 1950 is the State of Israel was founded in 1948. And then after the war ended, there was a war of independence that lasted about a year into 1949. And then somebody said, well, what about the Jews of Yemen? They've been praying for 2,000 years, yearning to come back to the land of Israel. And we should go get them. And they put together this operation, and it involved sending members of the Jewish agency out into the countryside of Yemen. 80% of the Jews in Yemen lived in these small little villages. They were essentially living, it wasn't the Stone Age, it was essentially the Iron Age. Right? I mean, when they came to Israel finally, there were people whose job it was to carry water on their back. And if you were in the marketplace, they would pour a cup of water for you that they had pulled out of the well, because there was no running water, and sell you a glass of water. It's kind of Isaiah 55, where he says, ho, those come for water to drink, right? So people still had that job in the 20th century in Yemen. And so the Jewish agency sends people to Yemen, and they scatter among the Jews of Yemen, and they tell them, the prayer, the thing you've been praying about for 2,000 years, it's time. And they said, well, what do you mean? It's a prayer every year at the end of the Passover Seder, Bashana haba Yerushalayim, next year in Jerusalem. You're telling us it's not next year, it's this year. It's now. They said, we need you to come to the airfield in this big city, and we're going to fly you there. They said, what? They said, you know the story about the magic carpets? We're going to take you on a magic carpet. We're going to fly you to Israel. I get emotional about this because they couldn't understand what an airplane was. And it was called Operation Magic Carpet. And they airlifted most of the Yemenite Jews, brought them to Israel. And when they left, they said, look, you don't have time. There's no time to pack. Don't take that big thing you carry on your back for the water. You won't need that, right? Your camel, you're not going to need the camel. Well, what can we take? Take your most valuable possessions. And what did they take? They took their manuscripts. They took their Torah scrolls. They took their sacred artifacts and their clothes. They said, you can get new clothes in Israel. And they took their most precious things and they brought them to Israel. And this was probably used in a synagogue for decades. And at some point, because it's rolled back and forth, that process is an abrasive process, right? When you roll the scroll, you're doing a little bit of tiny damage to the letters. That's how it's different from a book. In a book, I can flip the pages and do no damage. Right. Whereas, now maybe do damage to the spine, right? But I'm not doing damage to the ink. Whereas this handwritten document, the Torah scroll, you're damaging the ink, and you can do it, and it depends who you ask, something like 200 years, depending on how the ink is prepared, right? And each year, you're rolling it back and forth twice. So this is probably used for decades in a synagogue. And at a certain point, somebody realized, okay, the ink has faded, there's some water damage, there's all kinds of other problems, we can't use this anymore. And they put it in the back room of the synagogue, which is called the Geniza. And somehow it got from that Geniza into Keith's hand. And probably what happened is somebody said, hey, and I asked this question 16 years ago. I asked one of the top experts in the world on Torah scrolls. I said to him, you know, I've seen that there's people, and this is a few years after Keith bought his scroll. I said, I see there are folks who are buying these Torah scrolls. Have you ever heard of something like that where they're taken out of the Geniza and given to people? And he said, yeah, it happens all the time. They give them to little children to carry around on Simchat Torah. And, you know, at the time, you could have gotten it for 150 shekel. But if you're not Jewish, well, then it costs a little bit more than 150 shekel. He's never told me what he paid, but I guarantee it was more than 150 shekel. And the price has gone up in any event. So here he has a Torah scroll that's anywhere between 100 and 150 years old that originally came from Yemen, that was brought by these Jews who just lived in just horrific conditions. And when they were told they could come to Israel, they rushed. There was no ifs, ands, or buts. They left the place they'd been exiled to for thousands of years.
So I'm listening to him tell this story, and I'm inspired. I'm inspired because what we find in this scroll, if we keep unrolling it, 7 or 8 things that Hemi has never seen. I don't want to tease the people. What I really would love to do, Scott, is to sit and unroll this scroll with Michael one day. That's what I'd really love to do. But there are a couple scrolls here, and this guy's an expert. Now, what I think should happen, I'm just going to give you my opinion. I want to wait for Michael. I think we ought to do a special where he, from scratch, unrolls those scrolls and finds out what's in there.
Well, we could do those, but this has things those scrolls don't, and vice versa.
How do you know? How do you know?
I've already looked at them. I haven't looked at...
That's what you're talking to, Keith.
Well, I haven't looked at the whole thing, but I've looked at enough of the scrolls to see this is characteristics you won't find in those scrolls and vice versa. And I feel like we promised the people we'd show it to them. Would you be willing to come back, Keith?
For one more Shabbat Night Live?
Let's do another Shabbat Night Live.
Let's do it.
Okay. Are we serious? Are we going to do another one?
Let's do another one.
We'll do another Shabbat Night Live, and we'll share. We'll actually open the scroll.
We'll open it even more.
And what I'd really like to do is I have here a device.
Oh, you're going to bring out this
The
device.
microscope where I could show them things
that
you can't see with the naked eye.
No, he's got it with him.
Okay.
Okay, well, we're going to have
We have
another
to
one.
come back.
All right, so
Very
next
well.
week on Shabbat Night Live?
Sure, why not? Will you join us too? We want you to come back, okay? Join myself, Nehemiah Gordon, and Keith Johnson. We're going to open up the scroll. We're going to use the devices that Nehemiah has brought.
Wow.
This is going to be amazing. I don't even know what they're going to show us. I honestly don't know what they're going to show us. So we'll just have to tease it and say, you come back, I'm going to come back. We'll figure out what's going to happen, and we'll see you then. Until then, Shavua Tov. Have a good week.